The bell rang, echoing through the empty hallways. It was the signal, the mark of the end of another school day. For most students, it was the beginning of freedom, a chance to forget the assignments, the pressures, the expectations that haunted them every day. But for MIA, the sound of the bell meant something else, a reminder of the weight she carried, something that never fully left her. MIA sat still at her desk for a moment, staring at the clock above the door. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk as she felt the familiar lump form in her throat. She always had this strange feeling after school, a kind of emptiness that no one seemed to understand. When the last bell rang, the rest of the world seemed to go on without her, and she was left to face the reality of being alone. It wasn't that she didn't have friends. MIA had many people she could talk to, share laughs with, and even confide in. But there was always something missing. No one really saw her, at least, not in the way she wished they would. After school was when she could finally escape into her thoughts, when she didn't have to pretend that everything was okay. The weight of her life, the burden of expectations and silence, would become too heavy to carry. As the last of her classmates hurried out the door, MIA packed her bag slowly. She didn't have anywhere to be. She didn't have anything that awaited her at home other than the same quiet routine. But there was one person she would always look forward to seeing after school, Arthur. Arthur had been her best friend since they were kids. He was the one person who had never looked at her like she was broken, like she had some kind of flaw that needed fixing. He simply saw her, the way no one else did. Arthur had his own struggles, but somehow, he always seemed to understand hers. MIA found him standing by the gate as she walked out of the school building, waiting for her, as always. His tall figure was leaning against the gate, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking up at the sky. He didn't smile as she approached, but his eyes softened when they met hers. "Hey," MIA said softly, stopping in front of him. "Hey," Arthur replied, his voice low and comforting. They didn't need to say much more. It was enough for them to just be there with each other. The world outside could be loud, full of distractions and noise, but in these moments, everything was silent. MIA felt safe with Arthur. She always had. "Want to walk?" she asked. Arthur nodded and they started down the familiar street, the one that led them both home. It wasn't a long walk, but it always felt longer when they were together. The pavement beneath their feet was familiar, but the air always seemed a little colder after school, the world darker, more uncertain. As they walked in silence, MIA couldn't help but think about the changes that had happened over the years. They had both grown, both changed, but there was still this unspoken bond between them, something that had only grown stronger with time. Yet, sometimes MIA wondered if Arthur could truly understand her pain. "I wish things were different," MIA said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Arthur glanced at her, his face thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," she replied, her voice faltering. I just feel like everything is always a struggle. Like nothing ever really makes sense. I want to be happy, but it feels like something's missing." Arthur was silent for a moment, looking straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Then, he spoke, his voice filled with sincerity. "You know, MIA, I've always admired you for your strength. You've been through so much, and yet, you keep going. I don't know how you do it." MIA looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "Because I have to," she whispered. "I don't have a choice." Arthur's face softened, and without a word, he reached out and pulled her into an embrace. For a moment, everything around them stopped. The world, with all its noise and chaos, seemed to disappear. MIA closed her eyes and leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body, the comfort that only he could give her. It wasn't the first time they had shared such an embrace, but each time felt different. Each time, it held a deeper meaning, a deeper connection. In Arthur's arms, MIA felt safe. For a brief moment, she didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. She could just breathe, just be. "I'm here, MIA," Arthur whispered softly, his voice like a promise. "I'll always be here." MIA didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The feeling in her chest, the one she couldn't quite put into words, was all she needed to say. They continued walking in silence, side by side, the comfort of the shared presence filling the space between them. MIA didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if things would ever get easier, but in that moment, she realized something: she wasn't alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of everything by herself. Love, in its simplest form, was right here with her. When they reached the corner of her street, where they always parted ways, Arthur stopped. He turned to her, his expression serious. "I mean it, MIA," he said softly, his hand brushing her arm gently. "Whatever happens, I'll always be here for you. You don't have to go through anything alone. Mia's heart clenched, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to let the tears fall. She couldn't hold them back anymore. Arthur didn't say anything more. He just reached out and pulled her into one more embrace, tighter this time, as though he were trying to hold on to her for just a little longer. Mia buried her face in his chest, letting the tears flow freely. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry for being so broken. Arthur didn't answer. He just held her, the weight of her words sinking deep into his heart. He didn't need her to apologize. He never had. When they finally pulled apart, Arthur placed a gentle kiss on her forehead. You're not broken, Mia, he said quietly. You're just human. Mia nodded, wiping her eyes. She smiled at him through the tears, a small, bittersweet smile that held all the pain and love in the world. I love you, she whispered. Arthur smiled back at her, his eyes softening. I love you too. And with that, they parted ways, but the warmth of their embrace stayed with Mia long after she was home. As she walked through the front door, the weight of the world didn't feel so heavy anymore. Sometimes, love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about quiet conversations, shared silences, and the power of an embrace. It was about knowing that someone would always be there, no matter how difficult life got. As Mia lay in bed that night, she thought of Arthur and their walk home. She realized that, even though she still had so much to figure out, she wasn't truly alone. Love, sacrifice, and the power of an embrace had carried her through yet another day. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.